How to Win at D&D by Jeffro Johnson. We have a whole video series that we've put together in conjunction with Jeffro where we've tried to teach you guys how to go back to an old way of playing Dungeons and Dragons and RPGs in general. And every time we do, we talk about this venerable old grandfather of the hobby, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Now, we do that for two reasons. One, it's my favorite game. Two, this, as the granddaddy of them all, is a game that everyone is familiar with. Even those of you kids who have only been playing for a few years can recognize the general scope of Dungeons and Dragons, whether you're playing 2nd edition, 3rd edition, 4th edition, which I think is about to achieve kind of a renaissance as all of the kids that started on that get bored and look back and, little bit of nostalgia there. I think 4th edition is going to make a comeback. Maybe there'll be like an OSR for 4th edition, but less cringy than the original. And of course, 5th edition kids, there are people that have implemented these techniques in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and even some of the retro clones like Adventure Conqueror King to great effect. But what about other RPGs? And I got to thinking about it. I went to my shelf, which is very light these days. Not many games survived the cull. And one of them that did is this game right here, Call of Cthulhu. This particular game by Sandy Peterson and Lynn Willis, this version of the game, it's 98. Let's see if we can figure out which version of this is. I want to say it's 6th edition. No, it's edition 5.5. For those of you that don't know, Call of Cthulhu went through a number of editions that kind of nibbled around the edges and kind of refined things a little bit before undergoing some fairly substantial. This edition is very similar to, I want to say 3rd, 4th, up through 7th, and maybe even 8th. It's a percentile system, but the reason we're talking about this is because I want to talk about how, if you are a Call of Cthulhu player, implementing some of these ideas, and one idea in particular that will kickstart everything, can really change the nature and scope of your Call of Cthulhu campaign and open it up to new ways of play. If you've been playing this game for, I don't know when the original was published, long time ago. As I said, this one was out in 1998, and I bet if I look here, yeah, the original is 1981. So you're talking about a game that's over 40 years old. And if you've been playing it all that time, but you haven't been incorporating some of these principles, then you're really missing out. So I want to go through this and just kind of show you a couple of ways that implementing, and specifically to one-to-one time, we're going to use one-to-one time with Call of Cthulhu, and we're going to imagine what a campaign might look like if, for every day that you are not at the table, one day passes, for every day that passes in the real world, one day passes in your campaign game. Now, as mentioned before, when you sit down for your session, you can play for 4 hours, and today is, as I record this, let's call it June 1st, okay? So we have an adventure, and that adventure involves doing some investigation, and that takes a month. And then we travel, and it's 1920s, so that takes 2 weeks to travel to Egypt. And we go dig up a tomb, and that takes 2 weeks. And then we find a book that we read that will tell us where we need to go out and dig out in the desert to find the face-melting relic of the Old Testament. And then we have to actually hire the guides and the diggers. It takes us a month to dig it up. What are we up to, like 3 months now? That's fine. We cast the spell, and we melt a bunch of Nazi faces, and yay, everybody goes home, and we've saved the world. Okay, but except for the people that have lost a considerable amount of sanity for having gone through all that and casting the black-hearted spell that, although it saves the world, now that you've grasped the reality of the world and the underlying secret of the mythos, now you understand that those cults aren't just full of crap, that they really are trying to prevent the end of the world. And maybe you actually had to sacrifice a virgin to close the gate that would have destroyed the world, and you feel real bad because you had to murder someone, but on the other hand, the world wasn't destroyed. So was it worth it? Well, that's kind of the nature of the game, right? This is one of those, you stare too long into the abyss, and the abyss stares into you, and pretty soon you become the abyss. Okay, so in our example, we went on an adventure that took us 4 months. All right, that's a fairly big, substantial adventure. I think when we ran through the Masks of Gnarly Oath campaign, we only got about 3/4 of the way through before everybody died, and we kind of bailed on it. At that point, it took us about 4 months of real time, and in that time, we went through 3 months of of game time, right? Because there was a lot of travel and a lot of adventures, but we actually took longer in the real world than it took our characters to play, which is interesting. So that's one of the reasons why I think that one-to-one time can work really well in this. But set that aside. Let's go ahead and look at a couple of the specific rules in the game. And the first and most obvious, in Dungeons and Dragons, when you take blamage, when you are hurt and you need to heal up, you heal at 1 hit point per day, which makes it easy. Weekly sessions, you get 7 hit points a week when you're back at home, if you're resting, so that's easy. In this game, there are 2 forms of healing that you need to worry about. One is physical, and here we see healing. All living creatures heal naturally. In the game, an investigator regenerates D3 hit points per game week until all hit points have returned. Now, typically, thus it takes 3 to 7 game weeks. Like I was about to say, typical hit points are somewhere between 9 and 21. Well, I want to say, boy, it's been a long time since I've played this, so I'd have to go back and double check. They do have, for you gun bunnies out there, in the combat table, they do have a nice broad selection of firearms for you. I'm not going to look up right now because I want to mention one other kind of damage, and that's psychological damage. You have to worry about your character's sanity. When you learn about the truth of this nihilistic universe, when you pierce the veil and see that it is an uncaring universe filled with monsters that are like this size, I mean, as the joke goes, why do we even have an inverse square law? The more you know about physics, the creepier a monster this size looks. He shouldn't be able to stand under his own weight with that little. But anyway, the point is, you go crazy, and that's a thing that you have to worry about. And man, the illustrations don't help, do they? But the good news is, when you see a blasphemous monster from beyond the stars, there is a chance that you can heal up. So you go through, and let's just say you have a 1 week adventure, and your character comes out and he's got some damage, and oh wow, he took 2 points of damage because he got stabbed by a cultist, and he's healed up physically, but he went permanently insane because he almost got eaten by a blob. And in this game, they call blobs, I can't even remember what they call them. They call them Shoggoths. That's right. All right. Treatment of insanity. So you've gone crazy. You got stabbed by a cultist and you healed from that. But man, what does it say here? It says, if you go temporarily insane, after 1d6 game months, safe from further trauma, the indefinitely insane character, and here's some, right? Like maybe you've got depression, and maybe there's a way to treat that. If you're playing in the modern era, maybe you go on, like Zoloft? Is that one of the things that you take? In this, you roll a d6. That means, maybe it's 2 months from now, the indefinitely insane character finds enough mental balance to re-enter the world. Right? Oh, and then we can have private care. You can get psychoanalysis. If you go to a therapist, roll a d100 for each game month. So once again, you have a situation where your character may be out of commission for a couple of months until he regains enough sanity. You may go to the booby hatch. There's institutionalization, where you actually go to, and they're relatively cheap. Let's see, if there's a state hospital still because you're gaming the 1920s, what do we got here? Roll a d100 on a 1 to 95, add d3 sanity points. On a result of 96, he rebels and loses more. And then if you're wandering and homeless, if nobody's taking care of you, there are various things you can do. Now, why is this interesting? Well, this stinks, man. You're telling me that I sat down to play an adventure and it only took a month, and it's going to take me like 4 months to heal, so it's 6 months from now before I can use this character again. That means I can't play the game. Well, time out. You can still play the game. This is where things get even more interesting. Now, but before we get to that, I want to talk about some other things that you can engage in that may put your character in time jail. Okay, we've talked about travel. We've talked about healing, both physical and mental. And now we're going to talk about studying, powering up. One of the fun features of Call of Cthulhu is this long list of blasphemous tomes that you can encounter. And I want to show you exactly how this works. We're going to try to see if we can get this to zoom in my terrible setup. Some of these books have multiple editions, like this one here, Dole Chance. The original book was written in Burmese, but there is a German translation from the 1890s. What's the difference? Well, we don't know who wrote the original, but it was translated by Heinrich Zimmermann. And if you can get your hands on these, because the original, there's very few copies. There's also very few copies of the German. But however, There's more copies of the German. If you can get your hands on one, this column right here tells you how many weeks it takes to study these tomes. Even if you speak Burmese, well, I think this is part of it, that if you don't speak Burmese, because it's like an ancient form of Burmese, and that's definitely the case for some things here, like the Book of Yod, which is in an ancient tongue, and then there's an English translation. It'll take you almost a year to read the untranslated, and 10 weeks to read the English version translated by Johann Negus in, well, I don't know, it doesn't say here. But, okay, but take a look here, right? So even if you get your character gets his hands on a copy of the Dull Chance. If it's in the original language, he's going to spend a year studying that. You're not going to be able to receive this power-up. And so here, there's a sanity loss, so it hurts because you're seeing how the world really works, and it is challenging your imperialist, Western traditionalist ways. However, if you do, you will gain, what does CM stand for? Oh, Cthulhu Mythos. Your skill will go up by 10%, or 7 for the translation, because there's going to be some errors and certain terms won't translate. This particular tome is included in The Horror in the Museum, which is the supplement, but it's included here just for the sake of reference. The point being, your character has an incentive to get his hands on the translation. If you are using one-to-one time, you have an incentive to get your hands on the translation. This changes the game because suddenly you as the player are far less interested in the original version of these books than you are whatever cheap translation you can get your hands on. A cheap copy is better because you're only out of the game, your character is only in time jail for 10 weeks. The list of things, this game moves slowly. It takes time. You will not find very many campaigns that have the problem of 5th edition games where you play a campaign for a year, and because you're doing short rest, long rest, and you're not worried about how long it takes to train, your character has gone through 1 month of game time in the year that you've been playing, and he went from a first level spellcaster to like a 12th level mega wizard, okay? That doesn't happen in Call of Cthulhu. It's going to take a long time. These campaigns can take years because it takes you a long time to get your hands on a book. You may even find yourself in a situation where you find one of your friends has a copy of the book, and you can write him a letter and say, hey, can you send that to me? Well, it's going to take a week for the letter to get to him. It's going to take a week for him to pack it up and put it in the mail. It's going to take 2 weeks to get back across the country. This is the 1920s after all. So even if you know where a copy is, even if it's in a collection in, like, you're in Miskatonic University, which is on the East Coast of the United States, and your friend over there at the University of California, Berkeley, has a copy down in the basement, and you want to arrange a loan, a library lending loan, well, you got to put that in. It's going to take a week to get there, and then they have to process the request, and then there's all kinds of paperwork that needs to be filled out. So it's going to be 6 weeks before you even get your hands on a copy of that. Well, you may decide, you know what, instead I'm going to drive down to New York City, and I'm going to deal with this kind of sketchy art collector who claims to have a copy of the thing. This is a way to drive adventure and a way to get your staid tweed suit wearing investigator to go down and deal with some unsavory criminal elements because it saves him 10 weeks. Oh, I'm sorry. Doesn't just save the character, it saves the player. And now the players have added incentive. But there's another great thing that happens when you do this. One of the interesting things about Call of Cthulhu is that your characters do not progress terribly rapidly at all. And they really start out at a very strong level. And as the campaign progresses, the real power-ups that they get are informational in nature. Your players get power-ups because they uncover mysteries, they find additional clues, and the more you present to them, the more they pierce the veil, so to speak, the better the understanding they'll have of the threat they face and the steps they can take to deal with that threat. They are in a race against time. Time is important for these guys. Can we get the information that we need and implement it fast enough to prevent the terrible thing from happening? That's part of this game. And when you add a ticking clock for your players, it really makes the game more dramatic. But there's another thing. By putting your characters in time jail, you open up the possibilities for players to run other characters. Because your characters start out in many cases, they're going to be as powerful as they'll ever be. Because you've got that clock ticking down as their sanity goes down, 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 by kicking over to another set of investigators, you open up the possibility for interactions between those sets of investigators. Let's talk about what that might look like. Our initial group we talked about, they started on June 1st. And, oh, by the way, as a brief aside, some of these spells have dates that they work on. Midsummer Night. So if you started on June 1st, you've only got 3 weeks until Midsummer Night's. So that may provide some more incentive for the players to move their butts. Or maybe it can only be done on, a moonless night. So because now in a normal campaign, you would just say, okay, we stop, time out, they do whatever for 3 weeks, moonless night, we do the thing. Well, wait a minute, the players now may decide, well, we got to find some way to fill those 3 weeks, because if I'm going to be in time jail for all that time. So in that case, you can say, I'm going to spend 3 weeks studying that tome, and then we'll resume the adventure. So just mark that down, and you're actually implementing downtime as you go. Anyway, as I was saying, in our example, let's assume we've got a team of investigators, and they are on the East Coast. One of them is a Miskatonic University professor. One of the nice things about Call of Cthulhu is that your character classes, your investigators, if you will, they don't have classes. They have an occupation and skills. They can be something like, here's a background, and here we go. They can be criminal. And we've done this. I had a group of gangsters run through the, what's the fishy-headed mutants called? Return to Innsmouth. Private investigators, policemen. So these people all have day jobs, and that's great because it means when you are doing downtime, you've got a ready-made excuse. Look, the investigations that we do for a lot of these guys are done on vacation. My professor at Miskatonic University has to teach regular classes. And I think it's worth pointing out that this is not full-time study. Like, this is just how long it takes, because you still have to eat, you still have to work, you still have to do your thing. And so our investigator decides, look, it's June 1st, we had an adventure that took 2 weeks, and we found a magic book. And I said, well, my investigator is going to spend however long studying that book. Let's call it 30 weeks. All right, well, that's, we're up to 6 months now, let's say. So my professor at the university is in time jail until January 1st of next year. And during that 5 months in which nothing happens, we can advance the clock as far as we want, but we have to remember that we can't allow paradoxes. So while he's studying, we may decide, let's not continue this adventure until January 1st. And you might want to do that, because we've got a team of investigators over here, and they are archaeologists who are investigating the mounds that were leveled by the Cahokia Mound Builders. They're over in Ohio. They're working at the Ohio State University. And they say that because they're pretentious. And as they are investigating those pre-Cahokia Mound Builder leveled mounds, they discover some information, and they need to get that information from Miskatonic University. They now have an incentive. Maybe they take a day trip and they drive over. Well, it's probably a little more than a day trip, particularly in the 1920s. But they say, listen, I'm going to take 2 or 3 days to drive over there, talk to this guy for 2 to 3 days, and that may even change what he's up to. I got an even better one for you, though. What happens if you have a team of investigators that realizes that the cult they've been investigating is engaged in nefarious activities? They're producing some kind of drug that produces visions, because those visions will reveal, and they have to start working with the cult. And maybe part of the insanity, remember, the insanity that we talk about here is operating under the rules of this universe, not the rules of our universe. You could very conceivably have a campaign where one group that meets is a group of cultists. The other group is a group of investigators, police, G-men, private investigators who are investigating that first group. And you're bouncing back and forth, and maybe they're not even played by the same people. If you have a broad range of players to call on, you can actually turn things, and you can actually have different groups of people going after each other. maybe this group in Ohio decides they don't want to wait for the professor at Miskatonic University to finish studying the tome, so they go steal it from him. And they drive off. And, oh, look, now this professor has a reason to call the investigator who's down in New York City to go try to steal it back from the guys that are over the Cahokia Mound Builders. So each of these groups can start impacting each other if you haven't advanced the clock too much. Or maybe it's just a simple matter of, hey, this group, I know my other PC is reading a book that might have some information on that. Hey, GM, can we take a week to go talk to him? And the GM says, yeah, I'll tell you what. If you go talk to him, there's a chance that he has information that you need. It's a 50-50 chance. And if he does, I'll give you an important clue. So you go over and you talk to the guy, and maybe it costs a week of his study time because he's dealing with these guys. But there's all kinds of different ways for these campaigns to intersect. In fact, I'll give you an example here from one of the few supplements that did survive. And I should say survive. My version of Escape from Innsmouth, I actually got damaged in a flood, as did my Master Nyarlathotep, which kills me to think about because those are some amazing books. No spoilers. Mansions of Madness, 6 classic explorations. In the first one, well, actually, no spoilers in this first one. It's called Corbett's Mansion. Old man Corbett is he's a crazy old wizard, and he's growing a weird slime baby in his basement. And if your investigators go investigate and they meet this slime baby, they may take pity on it. And there's books, there's a journal up here that takes a half an hour to read each of these 14 journals. Oh, that's 7 hours. I got to take a day off. Maybe it extends our calendar by a day. But the point is, there's some fun rules in here, and you find rules like this all over the place in Call of Cthulhu. If the investigators try to keep the thing alive and happy, they will find it requires 3 pounds of raw meat per day to keep it satisfied. And it doesn't need to be dead, is one of the things. So they may become regular patrons of the local lost, what do you call the ASPCA? Yeah, we'd like to adopt, what's the biggest dog you got? Oh, you got an 80-pound Rottweiler? Hey, cool. We've got 3 pounds per day. Oh, an 80-pound Rottweiler, that'll take care of like 4 weeks, right? Anyway, kind of gross, but that's the way your investigators start thinking. If they are crazy enough to nurture the monster, they lose 1 sanity per week of such folly. Disturbing changes take place. The creature's immature arms and legs grow larger and stronger. Its size increases, and it begins to talk to them. All right, after a year, things happen. Okay, so maybe you're running an adventure, and inadvertently, oopsie-doopsie, this kind of thing happens all the time. One of your investigators goes crazy, and he kills the rest of the investigators and decides that he's going to raise this thing. You just created another adventure for the family member, the guy that went crazy and fed his party to the monster. Because now you have another set of investigators that can start investigating that guy. What if they're blackmailed into it by, some crazy cultists? Or, like I said, they just went insane. And now you've got one party that is trying to keep this thing alive, and you could actually run kind of an evil versus good campaign. And oh, look at that. You've just stumbled into, in all of these examples, a little thing we call faction play. There's a faction of people that are keeping Corbett's monster alive. There's a faction of people that are investigating the Cahokia Mounds, and there's a faction of people that are investigating the guys up at Miskatonic. And maybe the guys at Miskatonic are trying to stop the guys in Ohio from opening the vault that prisons the hideous, horrible, world-consuming monster. You have faction play. And it all springs organically once you start incorporating how to win at D&D. So this is just a brief look at how one-to-one time can change and probably improve your Call of Cthulhu campaign. And it can allow you to run a Call of Cthulhu campaign for, as it says on some of these books, 4 to 50 players. Give it some thought. Think about your favorite RPG and how gaming in Jeffro-Gaxian time can change it, expand it, and make it worlds more fun. Or, if nothing else, just make it feel like a whole new game. It's like going home again. It's familiar, but it's a whole new experience, and it'll give you all kinds of fun new things to explore. I'm praying for you.